This video is going to be my long-term review of the Specialized Stumpjumper, and this will wrap up my series of reviews. So I've done quite a few that I'll link in the description below. So in this video, I'm going to kind of sum up the whole experience of riding the Stumpjumper for the past 7 months. I've ridden it up and down the East Coast, Georgia, Virginia, West Virginia, North Carolina, and then of course here in Florida. So today I just finished a ride at Santos, which has really nice variety of just flowy trails. But today I stayed on the more technical trails because that's what I like doing when I come here. And this bike was really good. So let me first of all say that this travel range, and I said this before in one of my videos, I think is probably the best travel for an all-around bike. The only place it would be out of its comfort zone is on a pure, cross-country race, or on the other end of the spectrum, a pure enduro race or enduro type trail. So super tech, super gnarly, fast. Anything else in between, this bike is so good. It really surprised me. And I took it up to Virginia and I rode the Poverty Creek Trail system, which was pretty rocky. And this bike was awesome. And two things about the frame that I really like. One is the stiffness. The front end stiffness of this bike is excellent. It has a 34 fork on it, which, it feels like a 36 to me because of how stiff the frame is. But yet the rear end is very compliant. So this bike does not use specialized horse link design, so 4-bar design, however you want to refer to it. It uses flexible seat stays, which I've had a few bikes now with flexible seat stays, and honestly, I love it. It's got kind of a springy feel, but it almost makes the bike feel like it has more travel. And the Transition Spur is in the same category, flexible seat stays and a bike that feels like it has more travel than it really does on paper. So this bike, 140 millimeters of travel in the front, 130 in the rear. And like I said, that to me is probably the best travel range for an all-around bike. In fact, I'm kind of going back to bikes like this. I think bikes that have 140, maybe 150 in the front are kind of my sweet spot now. I've gone bigger. My Transition Sentinel was 160 in the front, 150 in the back. Love that bike. But it was honestly just a little bit too slack for my taste. Even up in the mountains when I'm coming downhill, I like the playfulness of a bike with a bit less travel. It's totally personal preference, totally riding style, but because I come from a cross-country background, I like a really playful, agile bike. Like I said, even on the downhills. And then of course on the uphills, a bike with a little bit less travel than an enduro bike is going to just climb better. And I did a comparison between this bike and the Transition Sentinel. Again, I'll link that video below. And I concluded that on the trails that I was riding up in the North Georgia mountains, that this was my preferred bike, because those trails were not that technical. There were some technical parts, but overall, it was not that technical. And I'll just throw something out there. Always buy a bike for trails that you ride most often. I think we get into this mindset that we need just as much bike as we can get, and then you end up being overbiked and you're not having as much fun. I've said this several times. I'd rather be slightly underbiked than slightly overbiked. The only trails that I ride that I think this bike might be just not enough travel is up in Pisgah National Forest, Bennett Gap, Avery Creek, those kind of trails where you're just going really fast and it's really technical. Other than that, and still, I think this bike would be fine on those kind of trails. I think that sometimes it's funner to slow it down and work on your skills, find the right line, and this bike allows you to do that on the more technical trails. On the cross-country trails, this bike was fine, except for the tires. I kind of go back and forth with the tires on this bike. They are a very soft compound tire. There's pluses and minuses to that. One is they grip so well when it's wet, especially over roots and rocks when it's wet, but they are slow. And I realized that when I was following, I rode with a subscriber of mine up at Blankets Creek, just north of Atlanta. And I noticed that whenever we stopped pedaling, he would just pull away. He was on a downcountry bike with faster tires. So these tires do slow you down. You do notice it on cross-country trails. But the advantage of these tires is, other than the grip, is that they mute trail chatter better than any tire I've ever ridden. It gives the bike a really damped feel in a very good way. And so, like I said, I kind of go back and forth. Like, if I was gonna ride this bike on more cross-country trails, hands down, I would change them out for maybe like a Maxxis Recon, front and back. Probably do that, 2.4. But I'm going to leave them on for now. I do have another bike coming in to test, so I'm not sure how much longer this bike will be in my fleet. But I'm tempted to hold on to it because I really like this bike. I like the frame. I like the way it mutes bumps. I love the SWAT box. I've said that before in my reviews of Specialized bikes. I just love not having to keep a whole bunch of tools on me and just keep them on the bike. And the advantage too of that is that the tools are lower. Your center of gravity is lower when you have like a pump and a multi-tool down lower on the SWAT box or inside the frame. Love it. And you can put bars and stuff in there. So it's great to head out on a ride where maybe it's an hour ride and all you have to do is put a water bottle on the bike and go. And you got all your tools on the bike. You don't have to even worry about taking them with you. So really love the SWAT box. Something else I've mentioned about this bike in another review, and I'll mention again, is this is probably the quietest bike that I've ever ridden. It's just like dead silent on the trail. And I think that speaks to how the tires and the frame just kind of really absorb trail chatter and mute trail chatter. I don't get any cables rattling around. The chain stay protector that Specialized puts on this thing really works to keep the chain from just flapping around and making noise on a rough descent. So let me go back to the ride quality. The stiffness of the frame, what it does, not only does it allow the bike to handle really sharply, but you get this feeling of being able to pop in and out of corners, which I really like about the bike, and that adds to the playfulness. The bike has a fairly slack head angle for a more cross-country bike, but a fairly not so slack if you're comparing it to like an enduro bike. So I'll put it on the screen. I think it's 65.5 in the low position. Again, I'll put that on the screen. I can't remember off the top of my head. Another thing that adds to the playfulness of the bike is the shorter chain stays. And other Specialized bikes that I've ridden have had shorter chain stays, and I really like that about their bikes. It just, with that little bit shorter rear end, it just adds to the playfulness of the bike. Some people like a little bit longer chain stay for a super stable riding bike, but this is the East Coast where our trails are pretty tight. Maybe if you're out on the West Coast where you're riding really rocky stuff, maybe you want a longer chain stay. But the great thing about this bike is you can adjust the geometry. When I ride in the mountains, I keep the bike in the low position. When I ride on flatter, more twisty trails, I put it in the high position. And you'd be surprised at what a difference that makes. I mean, if I had it in the low position on these trails, the bike could feel a little bit too sluggish for me, but put it in the high position, and this bike is, even with the, whatever the head angle is, 65.5, or 66 maybe in the high position. For cross country, that's pretty slack, but it's still playful, and that speaks again to the shorter chain stays and the stiffer front end of the bike. Component-wise, I've had no issues with this bike. I think Specialized really did a good job at speccing this bike. The dropper post, the one-up dropper post, still works great. The saddle is very comfortable. Like I really like this saddle. Like I would go out and buy this saddle just as an aftermarket purchase. The handlebar width I think is really good. It's 780. I've used 800 on other bikes. 780 is probably the sweet spot for me for a trail bike. For an enduro bike, I'd probably want 800, but 780s are good. The brakes are plenty powerful. The levers don't come too close to the bar. I can't stand when brake levers come a little bit too close to the bar. I got really spoiled by the brakes that were on my Transition Sentinel. I think they were the Code RSCs. Those brakes are so powerful. But these G2s are still plenty powerful. Really don't have any issues, no complaints with the brakes. I did notice, talking about components, I did notice that the rear shock gets pretty warm on descents, long descents in the mountains. So, You know, it's probably not as high performing as a shock with a piggyback reservoir, but not a big deal. Now, I will say that the water bottle cage is pretty low. Like, it's not a cage that you would just reach down real quick and grab it. You do have to reach down pretty far, but it's a trail bike, right? I mean, you're not in a cross-country race where you got to, you know, take a bottle out, take a sip in like 2.5 seconds and put it back. But, you know, it's just the frame's compact, the frame's low. So it's trade-offs, right? The center of gravity feels pretty low. I think I mentioned this too. This bike has a nice hover bike type feel to it. Like, you feel like you're just kind of floating above the trail. And the suspension, again, I was so surprised at how good the suspension on this bike felt. It was the first Stumpjumper I've ever ridden that had the flexible seat stays, and I'm a believer, man. I like it better than the 4-bar bike. Don't have any problems with, like, you know, brake jacking, where when you squeeze the brake, the rear end stiffens up, the suspension is not as compliant. I can't say that it doesn't do that a little bit, but I haven't really noticed at all, which, you know, it speaks to the fact that this flexible seat stay type suspension design really works well. I don't miss the 4-bar at all. In fact, like I said, I think I prefer this. It just, I don't know, man. It just gives the bike a plush but playful feel in the suspension. So as you can tell, I really like this bike. The only thing that I would ever do on this particular model is change out the tires. And again, you may like these tires for the trails you ride. If you ride in more loamy, wet stuff, or really rocky stuff, and you want tires that grip well and also mute the trail chatter, then you'd like these tires. If not, that's a pretty easy swap. They are tubeless. I'm definitely running tubeless. And oh, one last thing about the components is I really like the fact that Specialized put a 170 crank on this bike. It keeps the bike from having pedal strikes. Do I have pedal strikes? Every once in a while, but on really rocky stuff. Like today, I was riding some pretty techy rock stuff and had a couple pedal strikes, but that's just the way it goes. That's mountain biking. If it had a 170 crank, that would be more of an issue. I mean 175, but the 170 length crank arm is a really nice spec for this bike. The last thing that I'll mention is I did put a dirt skirt on the frame, and that is a little device that you adhere to the frame to cover that little gap in the suspension just behind the bottom bracket. I've heard that you can get rocks in there as the suspension opens up, and when it closes, the rocks will damage the carbon, so didn't want that to happen. I did a review on that. I'll drop that in the description below if you're interested in one. They're not cheap for what they are, but they do work. I did have an inner tube on the bike with some zip ties until I got it. That worked, but this just looks a lot better. So that's really the only modification I've done to this bike. Other than that, I've been riding it stock and super happy with it. So that's going to wrap up this long-term review of the Specialized Stumpjumper. I'd say it's probably one of my favorite trail bikes that I've ever ridden. Longer travel trail bike. The Transition Spur is my favorite shorter travel trail bike, downcountry bike, whatever you want to call it. This I would call mid travel trail bike, maybe long travel, just depends on how you look at it. Probably long travel would be the Evo, right? So yeah, we'll call this mid travel, but to me it's the sweet spot for mountain biking, not underbiked, not overbiked, for most of the trails that I ride. So that'll wrap it up. As always, questions or comments that you have, drop those below. And I do want to thank my local bike shop, super cool bike shop in Gainesville, Florida, who was able to get me this bike when these bikes were really hard to get. They came through and got it for me for review. So I really appreciate that. So check them out if you are in the area. Super cool bike shop. All right, I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks for watching.